Hello, I am not David Bashir. My name is Matt Winley, and we are here for the final home ground episode of 2025. Bash is taking a well-earned holiday, and we wish him a happy holidays. I get the pleasure of being here with Max Schiffman. Hello, Max.
G'day, Matty. Good to see you. I was going to say Bash has grown some hair suddenly.
He has, and he's ruggedly handsome now. No, of course, Dave's far more handsome than I am. Max, I'm going to let you do the honours of introducing our guest today, a man that we both know well, a very good man, but you can obviously wax lyrical about him a little bit more and give some context as to why we're going to be talking to him today about the Tasmania Stadium debate.
Yeah, well, there's been a lot of talk about Macquarie Stadium, of course, and, we often talk about the economics and, what goes into making decisions around it. But we thought today we'd introduce Phil Reid, and Phil is someone who spends his time working in the politics of things, because everything is politics ultimately. Phil, really unusual background, but he was the Chief of Staff to the former Labor Premier back in 2011-2014, Lara Giddings in Tassie. But also spends a lot of his time working through the politics on both the mainland in Victoria and indeed in that time in Tasmania. And so he has a unique understanding, I would say, of how those decisions are made and really what goes into them. So Phil, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Max. Thanks, Matt.
Yeah,
Still intrigued about Matt suggesting you both know me well and I'm a good man, which suggests maybe you don't know me so well.
Well, we also know you're an athlete because you've managed to hurt yourself slightly.
Yeah, my holiday period won't be as active as we might have hoped.
That's right. Well, you'll have a lot of time to think about the topic of today, which is Macquarie Point and some of the background. So I guess maybe to set the scene, obviously Tasmania is an Australian state, but it's a smaller state, and sometimes it gets lost in the conversation around the national picture. So it'd be great to get a bit of an understanding from you about, what is it about Tasmania that, the rest of the country needs to understand?
Yeah, look, I went to Tasmania in 2011, got invited down there to become the Chief of Staff to the Premier of Tasmania. I'd been to Tasmania once or twice in some touring and professional capacities, but hadn't ever spent any time down there as a decision maker. And we have this idea of Tasmania as a state. It wasn't until I got down there that I realised just how small a state it was in population. And I remember one of my first days in the office looking at the annual report for the Department of Premier and Cabinet and the financial reports. And at this stage, I'd just come from the Transport Accident Commission in Victoria. And I remember looking at it going, gee, the balance sheet of the government instrumentality I was working for in Victoria is nearly as big as the balance sheet of Tasmania. And the population was only a little bit more than double the size of the municipality I'd once been a councillor in Victoria. So it sort of gave me this sense of scale that while we think of it as a state, its infrastructure doesn't have what a lot of mainlanders would consider a state. Now, that when we talk about mainlanders, that's probably those major eastern seaboard states. There are a lot of smaller economies, but you do have to keep right at the start in conceptualising Tasmania and making decisions in Tasmania. It's 500,000 people. It's an island state. They very much feel their island. And this north-south divide thing, which, I went down there and I knew as much about the north-south divide as people in the north drank Bogues and people in the south drank Cascade. But in fact, I soon learned it's a very real thing, and that was interesting. I tried to unpack that because it comes very much down to, I think, ultimately where we go with the AFL stadium. The north of Tasmania was free settled. The south of Tasmania was the convict settlements. And so in Tasmania, there's always been this cultural thing about they associate the south of Tasmania was convicts and government bureaucracy, and the north was enterprise and industry. So there is, this when you talk about north-south, it's not just this funny quirk. There is a cultural underpinning to that. It's not in your face, but it is there. And it does go a lot to how you understand Tasmania.
So we'll get into a little bit about, we won't rewrite history because obviously we now know that the stadium's been approved, it's going ahead. But we'll talk a little bit about some of the cases for and against it, and why sort of it was such a hot political issue and a hot public issue for such a long time. But listeners of this podcast, I'm going to assume, are aware of a lot of the background here. Obviously, the AFL has neglected Tasmania for a long time when it comes to having a team in the professional league. They decided to go to places like Gold Coast and GWS when Tassie were banging on the door. The notion of having a team has come up over the course of the last 5, 6, 7 years again, and it was tied to you must have a stadium to be able to play. Obviously, Hawthorn's been playing in Launceston for about 30 odd years now. St Kilda were down there for a while too. North Melbourne's had I won't call it a love-hate relationship with Hobart, but it hasn't been the most successful, I suppose, enterprise down there at Bellerive for maybe a decade or so, and now they've sort of pushed out of there. I'm interested just to get your thoughts. Obviously, this stadium ultimately will be funded largely by the Tasmanian government, a very, very, very small amount by the AFL, but there's also a fair chunk from the federal government. So this is interesting. Can you sort of tell us a little bit about the politics around how the feds got involved and why they sort of saw fit to put money into this?
So it's interesting. Now, it was before the election. It was probably 12 or 18 months out. But what struck me at the time was when Albo made that commitment, he referenced the fact that as Infrastructure Minister and Deputy Prime Minister, he'd previously made a contribution to the urban renewal process of Macquarie Point, which was done when he was a minister in the Gillard government, and it was done while I was down there as Chief of Staff to a Premier. It was right at the end of our term. But he made the point that the federal government had chipped in money into the redevelopment of Macquarie Point before, and yet they'd seen nothing from that other than the development of a bureaucracy to facilitate development. But there were no shovels in the ground on any project down there. So as I said, it's a great project. So Albo's always been interested in infrastructure. I've got to say, I probably wasn't following the stadium as closely when he made that announcement.
Yeah.
To know, was it a captain's pick or not? But he understands. I think he's, as a minister and a prime minister, he's always understood the role that providing good base infrastructure plays in stimulating jobs and economic development.
Well, that's one of the key arguments for the stadium. You have this whole cost-benefit ratio analysis, and it considers things like the investment that it can unlock both in and around the precinct. According to some of the analysis, it wasn't hitting sort of the minimum hurdle, which is, a 1.0 in terms of at least getting back what you invest. But we've also learned from people who are heavily involved in key infrastructure, like, Matt Chun at AFL, and we talked about, the shift from Waverley to what is now Marvel Stadium, and what that did not only to place the sport in the midst of an urban centre and all the connectivity that came with it, but building an entire precinct around it. Some of that, you can do some math, but it almost feels too intangible to really understand the full impact. So, how do you look at things like that and go, do you actually deliver the economic benefit over that longer period in ways that people can't actually foresee today?
There's two ways, I suppose. What is we have to look at, can we specifically measure and decide and design the economic benefit we want? And when we look at those Infrastructure Australia reports or Infrastructure Victoria, Infrastructure New South Wales, the individual state bodies, we tend to think that this is, some magical abacus that we can put out and it's going to tell us exactly how much money we can return from. The flip side is we ask politicians at times to, we elect them and we like their opinion on things, and we ask them to drive and do things that the community want. Sometimes they don't have a value that's simply measured in money, and sometimes you have to take a chance and do something a little bit different. If we only wanted to do things that always stacked up to the nth degree financially, or that the bureaucrats recommended, then you'd absent the need to having politicians. Politicians ultimately represent the community. So if the community decides we want a Tasmanian football team, what are the things we need to do that? They might discount the amount of economic return they've got. Now, having said that, I would still maintain I think the opportunity at Macquarie Point will far exceed the measures that they've run. So I know Tasmanian Planning Commission and other infrastructure reports and other economists have all come in and had a look at it and all had their two bobs worth. And again, the simple fact that no one can agree on what those figures are says, well, there's no magic way of assessing this. We have to ultimately try and drive and stimulate an environment which has it at the heart of it to lessen the burden on the public purse and create new opportunities, new jobs, new industries, new houses. And I think that's all possible at Macquarie Point.
Let's park Tasmania specifically for a few minutes. I want to talk about the AFL. All right, Max, I'm going to put you on the spot.
Mm-hmm.
If the Tasmanian Parliament had rejected the stadium, do you think the AFL would have blinked and let the team go ahead?
Ooh, it's a very good question.
Thank you.
Yeah, I like it. I think the AFL is uniquely positioned in Australia where it understands what it needs to actually run a team sustainably. And with what I know of the AFL, I'm obviously not a decision maker or involved directly, but I think they would have taken the view that they needed a certain level of infrastructure to support a team. So I would be surprised if they said, we're going to put a team here anyway. I couldn't see that happening.
I think it's more than that. It's not just about what the AFL needs. If the Tasmanian team is to succeed, if an AFL team is to succeed, it's a national competition. The idea that you could have... let's put the argument somewhere else. If you suggested that the Goldfields in Victoria should have its own AFL team, no one would suggest that you could just play at some dinky stadium or, an upgraded Mars Stadium or the Diggers Stadium in
Queen Elizabeth.
Queen Elizabeth Oval. Yeah, that you could put an AFL team there. In order to have a team that plays in the national competition with 70 plus elite athletes based there, recruiting in a nationally competitive market. So it's lovely to talk. We talk about it in terms of this is about giving Tasmanian kids the chance to play for their home state. Yeah, it'll do that, but it will also be recruiting in a national market and wanting the best players to come there. And in order to do that, it needs to have facilities that attract those players. In order to attract those players, it needs to have that sort of ecosystem of sponsors and the like that will come to Tasmania. In order to get sponsors, you need to be providing those opportunities where the TV pictures look great, where the games can be presented in their best possible light. So, we can romanticise that it's all about what happens on the field, but what happens in the stadium and what happens for the vast majority of the audience, which these days watch it on TV, is really important. So for the Tasmanian team to succeed, it's not just about what the AFL wants. I think the AFL knows that for a team to succeed, it's got to have a base level of infrastructure that puts it on a national on the national platform.
Yeah, completely agree. I think you've enunciated what I was trying to get at much more clearly than I did. It is about that whole experience. You need to have, as you said, sponsor facilities. You need to have corporate facilities for them to arrive at. You need amazing training facilities, for the team and all the accompanying experts and health people and the administration and so forth. There's a whole ecosystem of people that need to be accommodated. And it's very hard to do that if you haven't got an elite facility.
Yeah. Max, I think you enunciated it very well.
You're very kind, mate.
Thank you. But the leverage point is a really interesting one. I think the AFL is probably the only sport in Australia that has the cachet to be able to do that. It's common in America. We see expansion licenses granted in the Big Four, plus to a point also to the MLS soccer around, stadium brings license. I've personally been involved in an A-League sense here in Australia on both sides of the coin, right? Involved in an expansion process in 2018 where I was one of the, let's say, quote unquote, losing bids alongside my co-host here, Max, where a license was granted to a club that promised to build a stadium, and that license was awarded and the stadium ultimately, 7-8 years later, still hasn't been built and probably won't ever be built, or at least in the form that they said that it was going to be originally. Then had the pleasure of working at the A-League on the most recent expansion process, and that this Tasmania thing was going on at the time as well. It's just like, can you use the carrot of a license in a market to say you must build a stadium before we give you a license? I just don't think, well, I personally don't believe the A-League had the cachet to be able to do that. I don't think governments would have bent over and done that. And it'd be interesting to see if the NRL tried it, but I don't think any other leagues do. Like, obviously the NBL is doing great things in Tassie, but they're now looking at redeveloping or making better fist of venues down there on the back of the success of the Jack Jumpers rather than the other way around, right? So it's that leverage point is so interesting when ultimately governments build stadiums in Australia.
It's interesting, just the language we use. We talk about cachet and leverage, and I think even when Max was talking before, there is a sense there, and you see it in the way this debate turns out publicly, that there's this undercurrent of this is the AFL standing over us to get the stadium. That's why I wanted to pick up on that. It's not the AFL standing over. I think it's as much about the AFL having an understanding of what it takes for a team to succeed at this level. So, look, as a Demon supporter,
yeah,
I get really annoyed at some of the concessions that have been made to some of the incoming teams, draft picks and the like.
Yeah.
But we have got a really good functioning national competition these days. And in order for a team to succeed, maybe it's, when we talk about cachet, it's not necessarily a sense of the AFL standing over governments and standing over the communities. I think what the AFL probably do better than most other codes is understand their product
100%.
And what it takes for the product to succeed.
There's a lot of people that don't like the AFL because of these sorts of tactics, and some of the other ways they go about things. But let's be real, the AFL, pound for pound, is one of the most successful sporting leagues in the world, not just Australia, in the world.
Undoubtedly.
And
the other thing that's really struck me about this debate is how it's become only about AFL, because we hear about all the other stadia that have been built around the country, and it's usually some sort of partnership across various codes. You've had AFL and cricket in Perth.
Yeah.
You had talk of, NRL doesn't really use it, but originally it was NRL or rugby and AFL for Marvel. So this was always part of the conversation, but somehow Macquarie Point's become all about the AFL, when really AFL will be clearly a key user, but it's only going to be one of the users of what is going to be a world-class facility.
It'll be interesting actually to say, let's not go down this rabbit hole just very quickly because I'm conscious of time, but are they ultimately going to be able to play Test cricket there? Do we know now because of the roof?
My assumption is yes. I know there was at one stage, and again, decision-making in Tasmania and who voices opinions and how amplified those opinions become interesting. So I know there was some suggestion at one stage that Cricket Tasmania had suggested that the stadium, because of the roof, was not going to be appropriate for cricket. I would be very surprised if there's not cricket played there.
Oh, yeah.
Whether it's Test cricket.
Yeah, it'll be the first test, I believe, that would be held under a roof. I want to build towards a positive crescendo. Let's just start on the negative for the start. The bully boy tactics was one of those things. Can you summarise why there was such a negative, or there appeared to be such a negative view towards the stadium amongst, yes, some in Parliament, but also some in the public as well?
I think there's two elements. So there's a bit of that cultural element we talked about before. So I started off talking about it's a small state. You need to understand the small state, the dynamics that are at play in a small state. Because of that proximity, people do think much more immediately about the services that they want. So they saw the stadium as, we don't need a big stadium here. We've got other priorities. The flip side is there are some problems with the Tasmanian economy. It's got some real challenges. I always used to, again, coming back to base understanding when I got to Tasmania, those 240,000 households I talked about at the start of this conversation, around about 30% of those list some form of government subsidy as the primary source of income in the family. So the Tasmanian economy is not as strong as it could be. Again, that's actually the argument, though, for why you need a stadium like this.
Exactly.
What you actually need, what the Tasmanian economy needs, if it can't compete in terms of the amount it can produce, it needs to draw in inbound
some stimulation as well.
Inbound stimulation and inbound tourism. Is absolutely, money for jam for Tasmania. It's fantastic state.
And you need facilities like that to encourage younger people to move there as well. I mean, it's also a fairly old state, if I can put it that way. It hasn't had the same replenishment of younger people from a migration perspective than perhaps the other, major mainland states have.
Yep.
So that's one of the other demographic challenges it's going to face. And you need things like this to stimulate that desire to be there.
I bumped into on holiday earlier in the year a couple of people who were from Hobart. They were in the health sector. And they were like dead against the stadium, like the AFL, but dead against the stadium because it was like there's so much more money that can be spent on other things. But it's. I think of it as being it's not as simple as that. It's not robbing money out of the health sector to pay for a stadium. There's different buckets of money that are available for different things. Or do you think that that's relative? It actually is more pertinent in Tasmania because of the smaller size of the budget.
Look, a lefty I might be, but absolutely consistent with being a lefty is you got to spend money to create money.
Yeah.
And that's the simple fact. You have to spend money to create money. Now, can it be done in a financially sustainable way in Tasmania? That's where I think the argument comes, and that's where I'd be saying the Tasmanian government still should be open to what else can we do with this site. Let's not make a dinky stadium because we were too busy cutting costs to miss the opportunity about what else can we do to stimulate creative industries, to stimulate housing, to stimulate specific industries that want to be associated with that sort of a sporting precinct, with that sort of aesthetic looking down the Derwent. Spend the money and do this well would be should be the overriding argument to Tasmania.
We've seen that in a couple of other big examples around the country, haven't we? Like Perth, the stadium has been amazing, done amazing things for Perth. We're going to air now in the middle of, well, I say the middle of, who knows, England probably would have gone out twice already, but in the middle of the third test in Adelaide. Adelaide Oval has done wonders for, the redevelopment there has done wonders for Adelaide. So major stadium acts in the middle of cities can obviously have such a regeneration effect, can't they?
Well, Tassie really becomes the only state without one at the moment. So it needs its fair share of those facilities to make sure it remains relevant and on par with the others. So I think on balance, you'd say it is the sort of investment that governments should be making. And I guess if we go back to sort of the political strategist hat for a second, obviously, there's a fairly recent election in Tasmania. The Liberal Party, held on and, has now gone and had this approved through Parliament. But with that political sort of background of yours, what do you do to try and protect this from a governance perspective? Like, yes, it's going to happen. And as you said, no doubt there'll be blowouts and other things happen along the way. But how do you make sure that whatever government's in charge doesn't sort of move away from the goal of actually this is a really important catalytic project for the state?
Now that's a challenging question for politicians because that's always the way. Ultimately, I have great faith in democratic institutions that they do get these things right. So I think what we've seen through the debate is a lot of voices get raised loudly. What we'll find in the long term, I think people settle down once a decision's made. We will find structures that get put in place. I think it ultimately comes down to what sort of development's there. I don't want to see government. I don't want to see us create layers of bureaucracy to manage the stadium. I think that's actually the wrong way around. What we have to do is, look, I'm a creative person at heart. I think the best way to make things happen in a state, the best way to develop public infrastructure is to allow people's creativity and ingenuity to come to the fore. So you do that a bit by using government to stimulate, but then having government get out the way a bit. Not saying don't regulate things, but let's not wrap it up with red tape so that nothing ever happens there. So I think there's a fine balance there, and I don't know precisely what the magic answer is, but I think getting that balance right is really important, where you don't stifle ingenuity and creativity in making sure that the site works to achieves its maximum potential.
All right, boys. We're gonna play a game. This is totally off the cuff. Wasn't warned about this early. I'm going to hold you to
This is
time.
dangerous
This is
with
like
you in charge,
Sam's
Matty.
drip tray. It's going to be really quick. If you go more than 15 seconds, I'm cutting you off. Answers for both of you. I've got 4 questions. I hope I don't forget them. I think they're saying the stadium more or less is going to be about $1 billion. What will the final figure be once it's built?
It'll be somewhere, I'd have thought, between 1 and 1.4 billion.
No, that's too wide. Have a think. You got to have a specific number.
well,
We're going to
no,
come
no.
back. We're going to come back to in a few years' time. We're going to come back and I'll buy a bottle of wine, like
I'll say 1.5.
1.5, 1.5 billion.
1.5 bill.
Well, I hope it's at that. You said I had 15 seconds to answer, so I hope it's at the top end of that, because, as I said, I want to see them spend more and get it right and do more stuff.
Phil saying 1.4.
Precinct.
Okay, no worries. You've got the under. Oh, bloody hell.
Is this prices right?
Yeah,
rules?
it's pretty much. I think they're saying the stadium is going to be about 24,000 capacity-ish. First season of Tassie's games in that stadium, the average crowd will be what, Phil?
It'll be so close to 24 to full capacity. This place will go off its nut once that stadium is full.
Max?
Yeah, I actually agree. I don't think there's going to be many empty seats in that place. And the only thing I'll add to it is I hope that by the time the first season's running there, they've developed enough of the precinct around it to really make it an attractor across the rest of the year as well.
The first game will ultimately, because we love stadium delays and infrastructure delays, the first game will be played when? What month and what year?
I have no idea.
No, come on. What are they saying? 2029 season? So will it happen in 2029?
I'm gonna
Put your balls on the line, Phil.
I've seen a lot of things take a long time in Tasmania.
I know.
I think,
like this answer. When's it going to happen?
yeah, let's go with 2029, but expect delays.
Okay.
I will look at it from a national perspective. We're building not only the stadium there, but we're building up for the Olympics in Brisbane. We're building a lot of infrastructure around the country. I think we'll struggle with getting the trades and materials that we'll need to get it open for 2029, so I'll put it in 2030.
Like that answer.
I'm still scarred by how long it took to build the Hobart Hospital. That's why.
Okay. All right. Good. Local context. More of philosophical. Ultimately, there was a lot of people that were against Adelaide, a lot of people who were against Perth. In 10 years' time, we'll be looking back and people are going, oh, it wasn't the stadium. Isn't the stadium great? Aren't we so glad that we built it? All that sort of stuff.
Yeah, stadium will absolutely, I don't want to say transform Hobart, but it will become part of the Tasmanian story in a really positive way.
Yeah, I tend to agree. Sorry, we keep agreeing on most things. The only thing I'll say is, as a St Kilda supporter, it'll make it even harder for us to get up and win a flag in my lifetime.
Welcome back to next season of Home Ground, where Max advocates for a 30,000 seat stadium at Moorabbin to bring back. What was the where Plug a Locket in the corner? Was it the animal cage or something like that, or where?
Yeah, it was never a friendly ground for opposition supporters down at Linton Road, was it?
No, it never was, and. But I think we'd need more than our own stadium to get up.
Yeah, okay. Very good. Guys, I think we'll leave it there. That was fantastic. Well done. Thank you very much, Phil. Good luck over the festive period with the arm and whatnot. Stay out of trouble, please.
Thank you. I was very glad to see that, my lefty tendencies about let's spend lots of money were also agreed with by the developers. So, it's not just about some tax and spend socialist here. I think the developer would agree that in order to make things work, spend money.
Yes, in some cases, absolutely. It's much easier to spend public money, though.
Yeah, very good. Max, have a lovely festive break. I think you guys are now taking a bit of time off. We'll be back in mid-January, and you've got your first cab off the rank, being Australian Open season, will be Paul McNamee, I understand, which will be good.
Yep, very exciting. Great time of year. There's lots happening over that summer period in Melbourne, as always. So look forward to having Paul on, and continue on in 2026 with the home ground.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. As always, have a fantastic break, and we will see you in 2026.